So, nice to speak at the second conference in Brazil. I was here a year ago. I don't think that David and I were scheduled back to back for the reason that some of our content might challenge the others' thinking, but it's going to. So allow us to do that. This is pretty well in its formative years. I'm not going to say it's in its infancy, but it's in its informative years. And while that's the case, we're still in the process of defining it, explaining the applications of it, and sort of putting the definition around it. Now, I've been working in this space. I've been working in crowdsourcing for 4 years, but I've been working in sourcing for 25 years. So I have a business background, ex-partner in consulting firms like Accenture and things of that nature. So I'm talking about this today very much from the perspective of a very practical approach to crowdsourcing. So now, last time I spoke, I used the word sex a few times. And I was told I was a little bit of a challenge to the translators there. So, but I'm actually going to start this presentation by renaming it. And go to my first slide. What am I pointing this at? That didn't make a difference. Does it really reach all that way?
Yeah.
It does. Which is the end?
Left, right arrows.
Is it the, yeah? So I'm clicking the arrows. Let's just make sure I get this bit right. Thank you. So just getting on to my first slide, and So, okay, let me keep talking for a minute. Okay, so I'm going to rename my presentation. I think in the original pamphlet that we produced, it's referring to crowdsourcing.org research. And then I improved the title and I recalled it Developing an Enterprise Crowdsourcing Strategy. So I'm actually going to rename it now to Get Crowdsourcing or Get Screwed. I'm sorry to try and make an impact on you like this. But one of the things that I want to leave you with today, and I'm going to challenge a lot of your own speakers, and I'm going to challenge David in terms of the representation of crowdsourcing. If you don't get crowdsourcing before your competition, then you're going to lose, period. Okay, so crowdsourcing is very much in Brazil spoken about as a sort of a social experience. So a lot of you guys are thinking about it from the perspective of collaboration and crowdfunding, things of that nature. But crowdsourcing is a very disruptive model which is going to fundamentally change the way that work is performed. Okay, it already has started and is going to continue. So hopefully from this discussion you'll have some perspective on it. So just a very quick bit around our organisation. We're about 20 people. We started about 4 years ago. We have 3 parts to our business. We do advisory services to enterprises and to big providers. So some of the bigger providers that are growing up are coming to us to help explain how they grow and scale within this marketplace. The other side of the customer base is enterprises and organisations that are trying to understand how to deploy it. That's crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. We distribute research. We have some of the only research in the crowdsourcing and the crowdfunding space. So we have the first research on the size and composition of the industry, both in the crowdsourcing and the crowdfunding industry. At the end of the deck, there is some discount codes to get very cheap copies of that research. And then we have crowdsourcing.org, which is the largest portal, which is really thousands and thousands of content items, videos, papers and things, which will really give you a very good research base to learn about this model if you haven't already found it. A couple of other things. My organisation runs what we call the CAPS program. The CAPS program is a worldwide program that accredits the performance of crowdfunding platforms. So this is a self-elected audit that these platforms go through to try and establish standards for safe operation. So you'll see certain crowdfunding portals around the world now are displaying the CAPS badge, and you can read about that again on our site. The other thing is, yes, that's enough of all that stuff. So I mentioned to you earlier that people in Brazil view crowdsourcing differently. Okay? And obviously part of my mission, which started 4 years ago, is to work very hard with my organisation to try and accelerate its adoption. So this is sort of the mission I'm on. Part of that is about maturity. So as the market matures, the way the model evolves obviously changes. So I get the fact that it's been implemented or it's been accessible for a shorter period of time in this market. Another thing is the culture. So one thing I learned from my trip here last year is that you have a very social culture, and your economic and political structure, or your working style is very akin to collaboration. So therefore that's a natural tendency you have in terms of wishing to look for other ways to exercise that. The other thing is obviously business needs. Business challenges. So obviously if you're faced with certain types of business problems, you're going to go and try and figure out ways to address those and to fix those. So of course we've got some very large companies in the US that crowdsourcing very much has been spearheaded by internet-centric companies that have lots of digital content. Okay? And as a result of this, they've basically pioneered the way in terms of getting access to this capacity and applying it differently. If you don't have some of those volume issues, then obviously you're going to be further behind in terms of understanding the application there. Okay. There's another thing here. Now, I'd like to sort of underline this in terms of it being really important. And I'm giving this same message to people in Europe and to people in the US. Okay? The problem with crowdsourcing in the way people are thinking about it in the US and here and in Europe is people think of crowdsourcing as a one-off event, or at best a series of events. Okay? And as long as you think of it as a way to address a specific need at any given point in time, whether it's raising funds on Qatar, or whether it's going to Amazon Mechanical Turk and getting a job done, that will inhibit crowdsourcing's development. I'll tell you now that there are leading companies that we are working with that are changing the paradigm. And instead of thinking about crowdsourcing in terms of a specific end-to-end set of activities, they're looking at their businesses in terms of how to integrate crowdsourcing into their business processes. As this starts to happen, and it's exactly the same, if you look at outsourcing, you look at offshoring, it's exactly the same in the way that grew up. As that starts to happen over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, crowdsourcing will become an established and accepted delivery model for very, very large and small enterprises and organizations. So I'm going to put these things forward now. Okay, so think about the different things it can do. So best ideas. So the best ideas, if you're smart enough or lucky enough to hear about them, come from unexpected sources. Exceptional knowledge exists within the enterprise, but it's buried. If you rely on the deployment of traditional management systems, you won't identify it, you won't harness it, and you won't deploy it. There's an expert somewhere for everything, but the chances are, if you continue to look in the same places, you'll never find it. Latent capacity exists within the enterprise, but it's untapped. Abundant capacity exists within the globally connected digital workforce, but new systems and processes are required to connect and deploy it. So welcome to crowdsourcing. So what I'm going to do now is, I've got about 20 minutes or so. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to first of all give you a framework for how to think about crowdsourcing. Because if you don't have a framework, if you don't have a context, then you can't think about how you might apply it. It's the first thing I'm going to do. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some data from some of our research to give you an idea of the size and the composition of the marketplace. It's a limited amount of data given the time that I've been allocated today. The third thing I'm going to do is give you a framework for how to think about crowdsourcing relative to your organization, so that you can start thinking about how to develop a strategy for implementing crowdsourcing within your framework or business. Okay, so I'm going to start with Jeff's definition of this is the definition that Jeff put up yesterday. And I'm going to start by saying this definition was created in, I don't know exactly, I think it was 2006, it must be 2006. There are a number of things that I think are wrong with it. First of all, it implies that crowdsourcing only applies to work that's being performed today. That's the first thing that's wrong. So, crowdsourcing applies to things that are being done today, but crowdsourcing is enabling you to do things that weren't possible before. They weren't possible because, for a number of reasons. It may have been inefficient, may have been expensive. So that's the first thing that's wrong with it. Okay? Secondly, it's talking about outsourcing. I'll give him outsourcing, but outsourcing and crowdsourcing are very different. I'm going to tell you why in a second. Okay? Talks about an undefined large group of people in the form of an open call. So crowdsourcing has moved on significantly. A lot of the businesses that we're working with are now talking private crowd. Okay? So open call to a large group of people really talks about undefined people. And one of the comments of the earlier discussions was saying that, you know, in certain types of crowdsourcing you get unknown characters each time. And you can crowdsource that way. But you can also crowdsource to people that you know, or people that you have identified in terms of that are performing your work, and you can repeatedly give work to those people and train them and help them get better. And the other thing that's wrong with this is it says generally using the internet. And I remember obviously David talking about how long crowdsourcing has been in existence. So crowdsourcing in the way I look at it, and the way I look at it is crowdsourcing did not exist before the internet. Okay? And saying that social media existed before the internet is a similar proxy. Okay? We were very social, I wasn't, but some of us were, we were very social before the internet, but we didn't do social media. Okay? We've organized people and we've collaborated with people for hundreds of years, but crowdsourcing requires enablement through the internet in order to be able to define work, distribute work, and organize lots of people very, very rapidly. So those are the things that I think survive from Jeff's definition. That may be small, so I'm just going to... so it requires, first of all, crowdsourcing. Any online community isn't necessarily crowdsourcing. So it requires participation in order to create something new and something of value. That's the first thing. It requires the internet. We just mentioned that. Okay. Crowdsourcing, I said, is enabling work that to be performed that wasn't previously performed before because it wasn't practically viable or affordable. Okay. Now this is important as well. New forms of crowdsourcing are emerging. So the model is already maturing in terms of the way people are applying it. So the first that we're seeing is curating. Okay, so originally the thinking was, you know, you can connect demand with supply and everything will be fine. Okay, well, not in all cases is that proven to be correct. So there is, depending on the type of application, there are people coming that are curating that experience. And what I mean by curating, maybe intermediating is a similar word, but they're basically helping the demand side define requirements. They're helping to define the work processes, and they're helping the supply side in terms of their interaction with that demand. The other thing that's happening is we're seeing the formation of private crowds. Okay, so part of this is a function of as crowdsourcing moves into different parts of the enterprise, you start getting much more significant issues in terms of data and things of that and privacy. So a lot of these organizations now are either forming virtual private crowds within a public type of environment, and if that sounds like it doesn't make sense, they're identifying workers that are qualified and then basically harnessing those workers and directing work specifically to those. Another model is that a lot of enterprises are seeing crowdsourcing as a way of basically increasing the utilization of their people by basically being able to distribute tasks from within the enterprise or maybe even from third parties and things. The other thing is crowdsourcing is different from outsourcing because outsourcing obviously is around restricted participation. There isn't the open philosophy, and there is an end-to-end responsibility. Crowdsourcing is the opposite of that. It's about open, it's about open participation, and it's a philosophy of disaggregation. So this is the definition that I like, and I have to attribute it to Darren Brabham. I added the last bit, the capital formation, but I can't put the name against this. So, crowdsourcing is an online model for distributed problem solving, production, and capital formation. Okay, and I think if you understand the definition, and now we're going to talk about the taxonomy behind it, then we're going to give you some data, and then we're going to give you a framework. You can talk to me if you want to know more about the framework. You have to talk to me afterwards or meet up with you, but a framework for how you go to your organisation to deploy it. So there's three different things there: problem solving, production, and capital formation. So the first problem solving is around ideation. Okay, we can speak a lot more about that, but we know that's about the application of ideation obviously can be applied to design products, ideas for improving services, new ways of understanding and responding to customer needs. Production, micro-task and expertise-based tasks. So David referred to expertise-based tasks, I think, as macro tasks. We refer to them as expertise-based tasks because when we define it at a lower level, some requires expertise, some requires knowledge. But the point being is they have more of a less well-defined workflow, and they require higher levels of judgment. And that varies again depending on the type of work. And then obviously we've got capital formation, which is crowdfunding. There are 4 types of crowdfunding model. Donation-based models, where people give through sponsorship, philanthropic reasons. They don't expect a return, they just feel good about supporting the cause. There's reward-based, where you get perks back. I think there's something trying to shoot me. It's my breath. And then you get debt-based crowdfunding, so that's already in operation in the US, but it's done between corporation to corporation. That's the way that they get around it. That's the way it's exempt at the moment. And then there's equity-based crowdfunding, and equity-based crowdfunding at the moment is only operating which the accredited investors and an awful lot about the Jobs Act, which hopefully will change all of that significantly next year. So a little bit of data. So the first thing is obviously people say, how big is this? How big is this marketplace? Is it really established? So this is from survey data that we did towards the end of last year. So the market's growing about 75% at the moment. And if you look at the outsourcing market as a proxy, the outsourcing market grew at these sort of numbers for a few years. Well, actually, it grew probably less than that, probably 20-30% for a few years. We're at the point with crowdsourcing now, where people are becoming more comfortable and more familiar with the model. So that acceleration will grow significantly. Within the outsourcing market, it was a good 10-15 years before we got down to sort of 11-12% growth. So enterprises are adapting to crowdsourcing very significantly. The other thing on there is its prevalence within particular industry sectors. So it's pretty well adopted. The entities that lead are obviously the areas of sort of digital goods, people that have content that displays well on the internet. As an example, obviously, e-commerce and online retailing. So again, e-commerce requirements, people that have big requirements for a lot of digital publishing are very prevalent. When you look at something like e-commerce and online publishing, that obviously runs through each of those different industry sectors. And you can see some examples there of how within some of those sectors, some of those typical type of needs which are being lent to the crowdsourcing application. So the other thing is, people are asking what types of enterprises, what sizes of enterprises are users of crowdsourcing. So it varies a little bit by category. The smaller organisations and the mid-sized organisations are actually, on aggregate, more significant now in terms of the overall revenues, in terms of the aggregate revenues. The larger enterprises are obviously smaller by number, spend a lot more money, have much larger requirements for demand. But this is like many different things. I mean, if you look at the way that the freelance marketplaces have developed, if you look at the way that maybe cloud computing is created, and then you look at some of the big ERP companies such as, I don't know if you have Salesforce.com over here, I'm sure you do, but some of those big social CRM, those CRM applications started by being an enterprise application that was available for small businesses, and then as it built in aggregate, it then filtered its way up to the larger enterprises. And that's the same thing that's happening now within crowdsourcing. So it's basically grassroots and then it's growing in terms of the size of the enterprises adopting it. Now let's talk about how do you look at your organization, and then how do you think about applying crowdsourcing within your organization. So instead of thinking about it as we can go and crowdfund, or we can engage over here in a design competition to create a logo, how do you look at it from a top-down strategic perspective? So most organisations, I mean, we're all familiar with functional charts where we see our names in little boxes within the organisational structure of the entity, but most leading world-class companies look at themselves from the perspective of a set of processes that allow them to define their business, grow their business, and manage their business. Okay? This is a typical process model that defines key enterprise operating processes and then management and support services. So from a process perspective, this is a very good way of looking at your organisation. I've got something I'm calling this up. So in order to be able to look at your business and decide where crowdsourcing fits, the first thing that you need to do is obviously understand, what are your challenges? Is it about customers? Is it about customer retention? Is it about lifetime value of customers? Is it about the supply chain? Is it around, is it about content? What are your business needs and requirements? Because obviously you can't boil the ocean, and therefore you have to go through an exercise to try and understand what the drivers are. Now, a typical enterprise will consist of about 30 of what we call process groups. So within each of these areas, there'll be a number of process groups, and then within that, there could be as many as 250, 300 processes. So the next thing is, once you've determined, obviously, what's driving your business and what's going to deliver the most return, in theory, you then need a way of prioritizing these processes in order to be able to look at particular areas of your business that are going to benefit the most. Now, I'm going to show you an example of a retail bank. So obviously and this could apply to anything. I mean, if you're in healthcare, or if you're in, you work for a social enterprise, it doesn't matter. And this is really saying that, within retail banks, they have over 5 process categories, 21 process groups, 102 processes. So they're very significant in terms of the way that they define and organise their business. So this is a process flow, a typical process flow, a process map for the area of check processing within a retail bank. Now this process could be anything. Okay, this process could be around a sales process or a marketing process. It could be a process around delivering content to a website. So it doesn't matter what it is. What I'm trying to illustrate here is, if you break down the work process and you look within that process, you'll see where the pockets of opportunity are in terms of the potential to apply crowdsourcing. So if you look at this chart here, so we have the golden boxes are the non-machinable checks. So these are checks that are rejected by the system, where, for David's comment earlier, computers do a really sucking job of trying to read those checks. So humans need to get involved to make determinations on basically whether they've been coded right. Okay, if you look at those funny sort of darker green boxes, they're areas where there's extensive manual effort required in order to engage and complete that process. Okay, so if you want to start thinking about crowdsourcing in terms of how you integrate it in terms of areas within your business, then you have to start looking at it at the process level. Some of those tasks associated with validating the machine reading of the checks could be a micro task. Some of those areas that require more manual intervention could be expertise processes. And then obviously there are other things that play here. So for example, if you have a bad receivables issue, instead of thinking about ideation from the perspective of designing a new container for a new product, you can still apply ideation in a crowdsourcing model for addressing some very core business processes. You can take any number of these functional areas and identify where either closed ideation within the organization or open innovation, open ideation is relevant. I think there's just a couple of slides left, so just bear with us for a minute. So now what we've done is we said, okay, we understand what crowdsourcing is, we have some sort of categorization, some taxonomy around it. We've established, because of the size of the market, and the fact that people are using it, that it's very relevant. And in other markets outside Brazil, people are working very, very hard to figure out where this plays. We've spoken about a process model for a business and looked at check processing as an example to say this is how you start looking for business in terms of identifying where the micro tasks, the equities tasks, and the ideation tasks are. What we've done, our research has shown us that there are certain characteristics that make certain work suitable candidates or not suitable candidates for crowdsourcing. And they're basically around these elements. Process nature. The more creative something is, the more we lean towards expertise or innovation, ideation type of process, the more rule-based it is, the more it will orientate it towards a micro-task. Process composition. End-to-end tasks are harder to implement in a crowdsourcing model because they require people to come in and do stuff. So disaggregated processes that are typically already disaggregated are much better candidates for crowdsourcing. Process goal, whether it's process results-oriented or progress-oriented. Level of automation. So, for example, highly automated processes that use ERP systems are not such good candidates. Okay, and then you can go down the list and look. Security and privacy, high versus moderate concern. So this is the framework in terms of how you look at these particular tasks and determine whether they're suitable for micro expertise or ideation tasks. So the typical process that you go through, the first step of it is to understand your business issues, look at the different processes in terms of identifying which of those processes are best candidates, use a framework to be able to go in and identify, based on those needs, which of these activities lend themselves, score the highest in terms of lending themselves best to a crowdsourcing delivery model. And then obviously, once you have a set of tasks, when we looked at this area as a finance and accounting function for a bank, I think it was, we identified 50 different activities that were perfect candidates for crowdsourcing. What we were then able to do is prioritize those activities to identify the first wave of 8 activities which we were taking to market. So the very last slide, the market for crowdsourcing is very, very substantial. This talks about it in the context of the maturity of the outsourcing market. Obviously, any work that's already outsourced, organizations have already figured out how to do integration, data exchange, they've already addressed the privacy issues. So there's tremendous capacity or tremendous volume or opportunity within those traditional outsourcing functions. But as I said earlier, there are lots of additional areas as well that have been completely off radar before. But crowdsourcing now is starting to make inroads into both these horizontal sectors and these vertical sectors. So the very last thing I'm going to do is, I told you at the beginning, I'm going to give you a couple of links to the discount code and things on this research. You can find the research on our crowdsourcing.org. There's a research tab right at the top, so if you go there, you'll find everything. I think these slides are being distributed, so hopefully you'll be able to find those links. But if you go to that research tab, you'll find them all. There's a discount code there for the crowdfunding industry research report. That report has been distributed, probably over 100,000 copies of that distributed worldwide. So try and get your hands on it. If you have a problem finding any of this stuff, then just give me a ring. That discount code 04F5 Whiskey Hotel, and then it's actually an I, not an 8. And then I couldn't find the other one for the crowdsourcing report before I came, so just email me or give me your card and write a report on it. Okay, thank you.